If you think ancient humans ate clean, you're about to be disappointed. Their diet was unpredictable, occasionally disgusting, sometimes nutritionally desperate, and almost nothing like the curated plate on the cover of a diet book. No grass-fed steak. No perfectly portioned avocado. What they actually ate depended entirely on where they lived, what season it was, and whether the hunt that week had failed or succeeded. So what did a real day of eating actually look like? The answer starts somewhere you wouldn't expect. Let's start with the single most important ancient food almost nobody talks about: honey. In 2009, anthropologists studying the Hadza of Tanzania found that in certain seasons, honey made up over 40% of their daily caloric intake. Not meat, not vegetables. Honey, eaten straight from the wild comb, often with bees and larvae still inside it, because the larvae were a valuable source of fat and protein that nobody was going to waste. Hadza men would climb 60-foot trees, get stung dozens of times, and consider it worth it. This wasn't a treat. This was, for weeks at a time, the main course. Here's what's stranger. Meat, the food most people associate with ancient humans, was often the least reliable part of the diet. Big game hunts failed far more often than they succeeded. Among modern hunter-gatherer groups studied by anthropologists, large animal hunts have a success rate as low as 10 to 20%. That means most days, there was no fresh meat at all. The image of ancient humans as constant meat-eaters, hunting successfully every day, simply isn't supported by the data. What filled the gap instead were the foods almost nobody romanticizes: tubers, roots, and underground storage organs, dug up with sharpened sticks, often bitter, sometimes requiring hours of processing just to make them edible. In fact, in 2009, anthropologist Frank Marlow calculated that among the Hadza plant foods, primarily gathered by women, made up the majority of daily caloric intake across most of the year, not meat. Marlow's data suggested that in a typical week, plant foods and honey combined outweighed meat calories by a significant margin. Hunting mattered enormously for status, for protein, for fat, and for social bonding around a successful kill. But calorie for calorie, day after day, it was often the gathered foods that kept people alive. When meat was available, almost none of it went to waste, including parts modern diners would never touch. Organ meats, liver, kidney, brain, and marrow, were often eaten before the muscle meat itself, because they were the most nutrient-dense parts of the animal, packed with vitamins A and B12, iron, and fat in a diet that couldn't afford to be picky. Marrow in particular was considered a delicacy across countless hunter-gatherer societies. Bones were cracked open specifically to get at it. This wasn't survival cuisine out of desperation. This was, by every account we have, genuinely craved. But what about the produce aisle? Ancient plant foods looked almost nothing like what's sold as natural or whole today. A 2015 study comparing wild fruit to modern cultivated fruit found that wild varieties were often smaller, far more bitter, packed with seeds, and dramatically lower in sugar than anything on a supermarket shelf. The modern banana, for example, is the result of thousands of years of selective breeding. Its wild ancestor is starchy, seed-filled, and barely resembles the sweet yellow fruit we know now. Ancient humans weren't eating naturally sweet, perfectly ripe produce. They were eating whatever survived, whatever was in season, and whatever hadn't been eaten by something else first. Here's the part that surprises people most. Ancient diets weren't consistently balanced or reliably sufficient. There were seasons of genuine scarcity, sometimes lasting weeks, where caloric intake dropped sharply and hunger was simply part of life. A study of the Kung San people of the Kalahari found that dry season food availability could drop enough to cause measurable, if temporary, weight loss across the entire group, year after year. This wasn't a controlled fast or an intermittent fasting protocol chosen for health benefits. It was involuntary, seasonal, and sometimes dangerous, especially for children and the elderly. The romantic idea of an effortlessly abundant ancestral diet, available year-round in perfect balance, simply doesn't match the anthropological record. And then there's insects, a category modern Western diets treat as a novelty or a punishment on a reality show. But that made up a genuine and reliable part of many ancient diets worldwide. Termites, grubs, caterpillars, and locusts were eaten regularly across hunter-gatherer societies on nearly every continent, and for good reason. Insects can be extraordinarily dense in protein and fat, often easier to gather reliably than large game, and available even during lean seasons when bigger animals were scarce. Some modern hunter-gatherer groups still derive a meaningful percentage of their annual protein from insects, not as an emergency food, but as a completely normal, expected part of the yearly food cycle. So if you're keeping count, a real day of ancient eating might include wild honey with larvae, bitter tubers dug from the ground, roasted organ meat if the hunt succeeded, foraged fruit nowhere near as sweet as anything you'd buy today, and possibly a handful of termites or grubs, all depending entirely on the season and the location. There was no fixed template. There was no single ancestral diet. There was only what the local environment provided that week, eaten with almost nothing wasted. Here's what should stop you. This constantly shifting, occasionally uncomfortable, deeply unglamorous way of eating produced remarkably healthy populations by several modern measures. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups have found blood pressure, cholesterol markers, and inflammation levels dramatically lower than industrialized populations, despite far less consistency, far less abundance, and zero nutritional planning. Nobody was counting macros. Nobody was optimizing anything. The diet worked, not because it was perfectly designed, but because it was radically varied and mostly unprocessed, forced into that shape by circumstance rather than choice. None of this means the answer is to forage your own termites or track down wild honeycomb this weekend. Nobody is arguing for a return to seasonal food scarcity or the very real risks that came with it. But researchers studying these patterns keep landing on the same handful of underlying principles: extreme dietary variety, minimal processing, whole animal and whole plant eating rather than isolated parts, and long stretches without constant snacking or guaranteed abundance. Not because it's ancient and therefore sacred, but because it's what your body spent 300,000 years adapting to handle. There was no diet plan. There was no plate photographed for a magazine. There was only whatever the land gave up that day, eaten completely, without waste, without romance, and without any of the certainty we now expect from a trip to the grocery store. We didn't just change what we eat. We eliminated the uncertainty that shaped how our bodies learned to handle food in the first place, and most of us never noticed that piece was missing at all.